Hey guys, today we're going to cover a more advanced topic in chess strategy, which admittedly is going to be most applicable to players rated at least 2000. When I think back at my lessons with students who go up to the 2200 level, actually this topic doesn't come up all that much when going over their games. So on one hand, I think it's a very important topic in chess strategy that definitely advanced players think about a lot. But on the other hand, it's something that really doesn't come up for most people until they get quite far in chess. So if you're newer to the game, this may feel, like it's not super applicable to you. But on the other hand, you're going to be exposed to a pretty fundamental part of chess strategy. So I'll try to break it down in a way that you can understand. Anyway, what strategy are we talking about here, guys? This is called the strategy of opening up a second front in chess, or basically finding multiple areas of the board to play on when you cannot break through in the main field of action. So I'm going to show you through one of my own recent games. This one was against a very talented young girl. She's just 11 years old, one of the top players in the US for her age, close to master level, Megan Paragua. You might recognize the famous last name. She's the niece of Grandmaster Mark Paragua from the Philippines. So yeah, she's got quite a strong family pedigree and definitely an up-and-coming young player. I would not be surprised if she followed in Alice Lee's footsteps. So here's the position. I was playing black, and of course the main target in this position is the isolated pawn on d4. So white plays knight f3 to guard it, and to be honest, even though black is better, and I would certainly prefer black here, it's not as simple as I would like to get to this pawn. Obviously, if I trade the rooks, she captures with the b pawn, the pawns come together, and they're quite easy to defend. So I didn't want to do that. And this was a very difficult part of the game for me, where I was trying to see how in the world could I be better? And what should I even aim for? Should I trade one pair of rooks, both pairs of rooks? How am I going to get to this pawn and so on? And I found something that I thought was actually pretty decent. So I started with the move b5. And she played the move that I expected, rook c2. I mean, I did not think that she was going to capture and give up the open file to me. So rook c2 was quite the expected move. I played knight d5, she plays rook here, and I decide to trade, actually giving up the c file, right? So I didn't go for these plans where I tried to hold the c file and allow both pairs of rooks to get traded. So I decide one pair of rooks left, and the whole point here was to play this move b4. So I was quite happy with this, and this pawn advance, notice where the pawn came from. Why is this relevant? Well, this is a very juicy strategic square that we call an outpost. And obviously as white, you're feeling kind of nervous when you see your opponent have a square like that can just block the queen and the rook and threaten the a2 pawn as well. So the computer, is not, of course, susceptible to nervousness, right? So he thinks white is still doing fine. Actually, he wants to play with the queen on the c file. So for example, even offering a trade like this, which is not completely obvious. Even during the game, I didn't necessarily expect that move because it looks like, wow, knight c3 could be really unpleasant, right? There's that. There's the pawn under attack. But the computer is just very calm about it. He just trades the queens, goes king f1, and I still cannot take the a2 pawn because of the checkmate. So he basically thinks white can defend this position. Yeah, well, you need definitely some cool nerves, I think, to let the knight into c3. My opponent played knight g5, which was certainly a move that was on my agenda, right? I mean, you got to look at moves that threaten you with, what's not exactly checkmate, but close enough, right? So of course I had seen that move and thought my opponent might try that more aggressive option. The funny thing here is that the computer actually thinks I could just ignore the h7 pawn. And so I have to admit, didn't think about that at all. And the point is that if they take on h7, I just win because these two pieces are hanging and the king can just escape to e7. So she shouldn't actually take the pawn. But in that case, if the knight moves somewhere, I can just play h6, giving my king a square, useful for the endgame, and black is substantially better. But that's a bit computer-like, right? It's hard to just hang the h7 pawn on purpose. So I played g6, which is also reasonable. And she played knight e4. As you see, guys, she's trying to control the c3 square, not letting my knight in. But this position is actually quite unpleasant for white. Black's queen is active. And of course, there's still the weak isolated pawn. That's going to be my main target. And meanwhile, what can be attacked in black's position? Well, actually nothing, right? This knight is doing a superb job on the outpost square on d5. So actually there's two potential outposts for me. There's the one that I'm actually on, d5, and then there's the second one on c3, which is kind of nice. So strategically, outposts, of course, are things that matter a lot for knights. And the main target will be this pawn, and white basically has to passively defend it, right? There's just nothing to attack in black's position. So it's also a very unpleasant practical task, and certainly for young players to play these technical positions is not fun. So I was feeling very comfortable about where we were going here. She plays rook d1. Sure, it's a passive move getting off the open file, but there really wasn't much to do on the open file anyway. And so here's the question. How do I win a position like this? I mean, my opponent has only one weakness. So we know that sometimes one weakness is not enough. Of course, yes, isolated pawn, a bad thing, but how to really get to it? I can't put my knight on c3. And that basically means we got to strengthen ourselves somewhere else. So I looked at the board, and yeah, this is something that like newer players, like they definitely don't arrive at in their thinking. But the move h5 for more advanced players is quite natural, right? You are not just passing the turn, you're actually improving your pawn structure for the long run and trying to take some space on the king side. So she played rook d2 and the pawn kept going. It just looks attractive to get to h4, fix white's pawns in place on the king side. That can always be useful. So my opponent kind of staying in place without a clear plan, but that's kind of what her position is requiring for the moment. Again, another improvement of the king, just trying to say, well, I don't want there to be any potential checks later on down the line. Rook c2. And now I had to make a decision. Again, I mean, okay, I improved my pawn, I improved my king, but where exactly am I going to break through? So I came up with this move g5. And I had, of course, seen this idea from a while back because I knew I would probably have to open up a second front to win this game. So I don't know, does that look intuitive to you guys? Basically pushing a pawn in front of the king, of course, is a big decision. But I figured my pieces were so strong and the center was very much under control that I could do it. And of course, the main point of this is to play g4 and actually open up the king side to give me a second area of play. By the way, the interesting thing, and I noticed in one of the comments on YouTube, we had a viewer who suggested that I talk about the way that humans and computers evaluate positions differently. It's actually a very interesting topic, and I will do some videos on that, guys. I think this is one example of that. I turned on the Cloud Engine, which basically is just, a fast, strong computer, to analyze this position. And the move g5 is basically, barely making it into the top 5 moves that it wants to play. So it sort of like pops up, 5, 6, 4, but it's not the best move. However, practically speaking, it is going to be the reason why I win this game. So I think for a human, you kind of appreciate the power, the strategic power of this move g5, the psychological impact it has on the opponent as well. And the computer doesn't appreciate that. That's definitely a clear difference, guys. It's not that it thinks that g5 is a bad move. It just doesn't, feel the importance of it the way a human being does. But in the game, I felt like this was, of course, a big move, a big commitment, and also quite uncomfortable for my opponent. So she played rook d2. And now I went with g4, right? So I'm being consistent. Also, my opponent was getting close to time trouble. So this seemed logical. But I want to show you something really cool. that the computer showed me. So I could have actually opened up a third front. That was a little bit beyond my understanding, guys, but I could have moved up this pawn. I mean, of course, it seems reasonably useful to, let's say, support the b4 pawn. In some cases, it's nice to have it guarded. But the other idea is that there's a bunch of positions where I can push the pawn to a4. So for example, like white doesn't have a whole lot of moves here, right? White's passive, but let's say she just goes back with the rook and I go a4. And I was thinking, well, if the pawn takes, maybe what's my point? Is it rook a8? Trying to get the pawn back? Maybe. But no, the computer shows this brilliancy. Yeah, I really loved this move, guys. It's just so beautiful to put a pawn on prise by two pieces, but of course, white loses no matter how they take. The threat of knight b4, super unpleasant, right? So if they take like that, they get forked. And then you can even just take the knight. Since they can't take your knight, they'll be down a rook. So you're basically going to be up a piece here. Yeah, so this idea of like a5 to actually give yourself a4 ideas is pretty amazing. And here's actually another cool line. Like let's say white doesn't go rook c2, and they go knight c5. So here the computer suggests queen f6, basically vacating that square for the knight. And after knight here, we're doing a little repositioning of the queen to f5. And let's say here we trade. White can recapture in two ways, but the knight is going to head to one of these squares. So let's say they take with the knight. And you see, guys, the power of the pawn here. Like I'm actually free to move my knight because the pawn's protecting the other pawn. So there was some real utility. And actually, I'm going to win the d4 pawn no matter what. Because as soon as this knight moves, let's say somewhere here, if I want, which by the computer doesn't even necessarily advocate, but certainly I can take this pawn using a simple tactic to stay up a pawn ahead in the knight endgame. And I think, again, from a human perspective, this looks like a very difficult endgame for white to hold. So there was a more advanced way I could have carried out my strategy, right? Opening up the third front and just playing on all three sides of the board. So I do really appreciate this move a5, but I didn't think of it. So I went a little bit more primitively with g4. By the way, to backtrack just for a second, I mean, when I played g5, I considered various moves here for white, right? She can certainly do more than just stay in place. I thought perhaps she could try this move f3. And of course, it's an ugly positional move. Ugly because you're weakening a lot of squares by your king. You're weakening the e3 square, which is quite a sensitive square. But I thought, well, maybe it's worth it. I mean, g4 is definitely an important idea for black. But the computer shows, indeed, knight e3, let's say rook c5. And now, not knight f5, which is sort of the obvious move to try to attack d4, because that allows white counterplay with d5. But the move f5, now that the knight can no longer go to c5 because the rook is there, this is actually very effective. There's not even like a check from here because of the queen. And basically you're forcing the knight off and d4 will finally get taken. So it wasn't that easy for white to actually prevent the move g4. The other possibility is something like queen e2, but now I can go knight f6. And I can actually do the strategy of trading my strong knight in order to just get to the d4 pawn. So if they take, which they pretty much have to, I can take with either my king or my queen. I mean, this might look scary to you guys, but the king is actually pretty safe. There's no checks. And this pawn is going to be claimed on the next turn. So black will just have a healthy extra pawn for the ensuing endgame. So yeah, it was not very easy for white to actually stop the move g4. So practically speaking, I think it's a good decision. So she went rook d2. Like I said, a5 would have been very cool, but I played g4, in my own primitive way, pushing the pawn. At least it's consistent. And she plays g3, which is actually a really good chance. I mean, Right now, I'm threatening to take. So she obviously does not want to get her king opened up, but she won't be able to take with the queen because the knight will hang, right? So she definitely has to do something. And if she takes my pawn, well, this is what I'm aiming for. It's that second front I've been talking about. Like now the king side is opened up. Knight f4 is definitely an annoying idea. And I mean, in these positions, I was even thinking like I could move my king somewhere back and bring the rook to g8. I mean, why not? We are quite well positioned on the king side. And the point is that even though normally the side that's getting attacked wants to trade queens like this, well, you can't really do that kind of queen trade because it ruins your structure too much. Then you're just going to suffer enormously in the end game. I mean, you have double pawns, isolated pawn, and plus black's h-pawn is really good. So that's what my opponent was facing. So she chose a good idea, g3, trying to push me back. And I don't know, maybe I didn't play the most accurate move here. The computer says I should have taken. I really didn't want to take and kind of help her connect her rook to the king side. So I played the move queen f5. Again, from a practical point of view, it's turned out to be the right decision because my opponent's best move here, really the only one that solves her problems, is not an easy one to make. She should have taken this pawn. Now, that move involves like real calculation, guys. Like you don't just do it by intuition, right? Because first of all, you're letting the knight in. That looks super scary to get forked like that. And then you have to see, well, that fork isn't really that big of a deal because I have this intermediate capture. So then you have to leave your queen on prise to see that your opponent's queen can be taken. And then you also have to see that like here you have the block. And I suppose you also need to see, okay, there's no fork here because the rook would just take, right? That would be a blunder. So white kind of saves themselves in this type of way. I mean, maybe the best I can do is go for some, little tricks like that. I just want to keep showing you these knight forks because they're so prevalent in this position. And it's just going to be some sort of equal knight endgame, right? But from a practical point of view in time trouble, I think to capture on h4, and there's just so much that you have to see, right? Besides knight f4, you also have to look at that. I mean, looks like it could be quite scary. The g file opened up. The pawn in h3 is strong. But again, somehow white is holding it together. Is it like obvious to me that, like with the rook coming to g8, this isn't really scary? No, it's not. I mean, the computer holds it. Somehow they put the knight here. I got to show you one thing. Like there's some line like this, and let's just try some random move for white. Like what can I do? I don't know, king h2 maybe, right? I think it'll work. And then I was like, can we go f6? But look at that. There's another knight fork. Isn't that cool, guys? There's just so many of them in this game. And then that one is good for white. So we can't blunder into that. But anyway, finding the move gh4 is not easy. And again, kind of harkens back to that question, like computer evaluation versus human perception, right? I mean, I felt in this position, even though I knew the move g3 was strong, I felt like, of course, it was still not easy for white to play. So she took this pawn on g4 and giving me an easy recapture. What am I threatening here? Well, do I even have a direct threat? I don't know. Maybe pushing the pawn to h3, maybe just going like rook h8, maybe even rook c8 is an idea. You can always think about coming from this side. So there's like multiple ideas. Of course, the initiative belongs to black. She played f3, trying to connect the rook to the king side. In general, a pretty decent idea. I went back, and here, finally, as often happens when you're defending under pressure, you crack, and, especially under time pressure, as well as on the board. And she played this move, knight c5, trying to get a queen trade. And of course, using the fact that I cannot take this pawn because I get pinned. So she thought she had a tricky tactic here. The better move, which is not very easy to see, was the move g4. I mean, well, better in the sense like, better like it doesn't lose, right? Of course, f4 is a very weak square. It's exactly what I wanted, basically. Like that, this is like my plan kind of coming to fruition. Like I want white's king to look like this. I want there to be more available juicy squares in the position for my pieces to use, more infiltrations into the position. So basically I wouldn't be like unhappy even if my opponent played g4. Now, rook g2 is an interesting move that I just thought of, but I have a lot of moves on that. Yeah, I can think about h3. And the funny thing is she doesn't even really threaten anything with that move, and I'll explain why in a second. But anyway, so she played knight c5, and guess what? I took the pawn that I'm supposedly not able to take, guys. And why did I do that? Did I want to lose my queen? No, but it's because I realized that there is no way to win the queen, because again, we have that theme of knight fork. I would just take the rook and be winning the queen on d3 with an extra exchange and a completely winning position. So yeah, it was a big oversight for sure to end the game. Of course, losing the g3 pawn is very painful for white. And the funny thing is that, like, again, there's not even like a block with the rook because of the exact same trick. So she's got to go back. And then I felt quite lovely to play rook g8. You know, I normally don't like to put my rooks behind pieces, right? You want to put rooks on open files, but it's kind of cool how there will be an open file for that rook no matter what. And there's still no check, right? It's like the knight on d5 is a massive, massive piece. So she played here. And at this moment, you know, I wasn't as accurate as I should have been. I actually should have played the check using the fact, well, she can't go this way because I take the rook, and she still can't block because I take the rook. And then when she goes there, I'm basically giving a check from that square, pushing the king out, and I can do anything to that king, right? I can go with knight f4, checkmate. I guess that's pretty good. But for some reason, I was so eager to open up my rook that I went for this. It took me a little bit longer to win because now I don't get the check on e1 that I would like, you know, so she kind of gets to hold on for a few moves as I try to pick up more stuff in the position. So I did a little knight maneuver. You know, it's funny because I even have, again, this kind of queen sack idea for the knight fork on g3. But she tried to get the queen out of the way, also to stop, you know, queen c1 check that was being threatened. And I traded off the knight, which is one of the defenders, and either my g-pawn is going to keep going forwards or, you know, something's going to happen on the h-files. Basically, it's not just that black is up a pawn here, white is getting mated. And yeah, here she resigned because we're basically like a move or two away from checkmate. Okay, guys. So yeah, I was kind of happy because I think this game kind of showed that this strategy of opening up a second front can be very effective. And even though it may have seemed a little surprising to some of you that I was like willing to open up my own king in the process, but when you have really good control over the center, you know, you can actually, and when you have space, right? And remember, I moved up this pawn to h4 to kind of create that space advantage, right? That's what really opened up this opportunity for me to play on the king side as well. So yeah, I mean, the idea is we're not always able to win the game in one part of the board. Now, the reason I'm saying this is more relevant for advanced players is because for most people, it's enough to just attack on one part of the board and you will win. Your opponents will make mistakes, blunder pieces. You really don't have to do anything too deep. But when you go up the levels in chess and you start to face more resistance, where people are not blundering stuff to you and they realize what they need to defend, then in order to break them down, you will have to really look at the whole board to figure out where else your position can be improved and where else play can be generated to make it just too difficult for them to hold on everywhere. So that's the strategy, guys, of the second front. And by the way, it's a little bit like in life, right? Like in life, you also need to play on all fronts. So hopefully you enjoyed that, guys. And let's do a little recap of our Thanksgiving weekend. We had a goal to make it to 10,000 subscribers, and we made it over Thanksgiving. So thank you. I was very thankful for that, guys. And I had a wonderful week in California. And of course, as a chess player, I thought ahead, and I thought we would probably make that goal. So I did some Black Friday shopping in advance. I have my leather jacket already prepared for that day. So now we're on to our next goal of 20,000. And I'll see you guys in the next video.